When a 41-year-old mother guns down the father of her children and his new wife, and enraptured media dubs her Angry Betty.
There are some stories that never really leave the public memory, because no matter how many years pass, they still feel painful to revisit. Betty Broderick's story is one of them. Once living what looked like the perfect American life, she eventually became the center of one of the most shocking crimes of the 20th century. Now at 78 years old, the reality of where her life ended up feels far darker, lonelier, and more heartbreaking than most people ever imagined.
Dramatic trials of Betty Broderick grab the public's interest and play out live on court TV for all of America to see.
I moved, they moved, the gun went off, and it was that fast.
The last Friday morning. At 3:40 in the morning on Friday, May 8th, 2026, inside a quiet hospital room in San Bernardino County, California, 78-year-old Betty Broderick lies beneath thin white sheets as her 4 children stand silently around her bed. 3 weeks earlier, Betty had taken a bad fall inside the California Institution for Women in Chino, breaking several of her ribs. According to reports, an infection set in and spread through her body until her organs began to shut down. On the 18th of April, prison officials transferred her to a higher level of medical care. She would never make it back. Her doctor wrote the cause of death as natural, though the San Bernardino County coroner is still waiting to make that official. Now, here is the part that hits the hardest. Betty had served more than 37 years behind bars. She had been denied parole 3 separate times, in 2010, in 2011, and again in 2017. After that last denial, the parole board told her she could not even apply again until January of 2032. She would have been 84 years old before she could even ask. She did not make it that long. Her 4 children released a statement that broke a lot of people. They called her an amazingly fun, smart, engaging, and loving mom. They admitted the relationship was complicated for obvious reasons. And then they were quiet again. A former San Diego prosecutor named Richard Sachs, who once stood across from her in court, told reporters something chilling after her death. He said that even after all these years, the bitterness was still there. The anger was still there. A San Diego author who exchanged letters with Betty for 3 years described her as misunderstood and frantic, as if she had been running from something her whole life. So here is the question that pulled us into her story. What does it take to turn a Catholic girl from New York, the dream wife of a millionaire lawyer, into a woman who would die alone in a prison hospital bed? Let's find out. The childhood that shaped Betty. Long before she became Betty Broderick, she was a little girl named Elizabeth Ann Bishalia. She was born on the 7th of November, 1947, in a quiet New York suburb called Bronxville. Her father, Frank, was the son of Italian immigrants who built a successful plastering business with his own hands. Her mother, Marita, came from an Irish Catholic family. Together, they raised 6 children inside a very strict version of the Catholic faith. Betty was the 3rd of those 6. She went to Catholic schools her entire childhood. She learned to keep her hands folded, her skirt at the right length, and her voice respectful. She was taught from the time she could walk that her future would follow a very specific shape. You went to Catholic schools. You were careful with dating until you found yourself a good Catholic man. You supported him through whatever it took, and then you were blessed in your later years with beautiful grandchildren. That was the deal, and Betty believed in it completely. At 17 years old, she enrolled at the College of Mount St. Vincent in the Bronx. She was smart, popular, and the kind of girl who lit up a room. That same year, in 1965, she traveled out to Indiana for a chaperoned football weekend at the University of Notre Dame. It was there, at a party arranged for nice Catholic students, that she met him. His name was Daniel Thomas Broderick III. He was 21 years old, a senior in the pre-medical program, and he came from a big Irish Catholic family. He had a sharp jaw, a sharper mind, and an ambition that practically vibrated off his skin. He looked at Betty across that crowded room and decided, in his own words later, that she was going to be his wife. Betty fell hard. She fell the way Catholic girls in 1965 were supposed to fall. She fell trusting every word he whispered to her about the life they would build together. He promised her the moon, and she believed him, because that was the only currency she had ever been handed. We want you to pause and feel the weight of that promise for a moment, because every single thing that came after, the marriage, the betrayal, the gunshots, the prison cell, all of it traces back to a young girl who simply believed. The breaking point. They were married on the 12th of April, 1969, at the Immaculate Conception Church in Tuckahoe, New York. Betty was 21 years old. She walked down the aisle as Elizabeth Ann Bishalia and walked back up as Mrs. Daniel Broderick. From that day forward, her life would be measured by what she could give him. And boy, did she give. Dan wanted to be a doctor first, so Betty worked odd jobs to put him through Cornell University Medical College. He earned his medical degree, but then he decided medicine was not enough. He wanted to be a lawyer too, so he applied to Harvard Law School and got in. Betty kept working. She washed dishes, sold cosmetics, and took on anything that paid. 3 years later, in 1973, Dan walked out of Harvard with his law degree, and Betty walked out of those years with absolutely nothing in her own name. That same year, the couple moved across the country to San Diego, California. Dan joined the prestigious law firm of Gray, Carey, Ames, and Fry, while Betty stepped into a role with no paycheck attached. She became his wife and his hostess and the mother of his children, and she had no resume of her own anymore, because every line of it had already been spent on him. She had 4 children who lived. The eldest was Kim, born in 1970. Then came Kathy Lee, who everyone called Lee, in 1971. In 1973, Betty gave birth to a baby boy, who died only 2 days later. She would also disclose that she went through an abortion in 1974, a piece of her story she carried in silence for decades. Then came Daniel IV in 1976, and finally Rhett in 1979. In her own unpublished memoir, Betty wrote one of the most heartbreaking sentences you have ever read about a marriage. She said she went from being accomplished, well-connected, and free to being isolated from family and friends and trapped with 2 children for whom she was 100% responsible. That word trapped is going to come back to haunt this story. Because by the time Dan started bringing home $1 million a year and walking through the doors of San Diego high society, Betty had already given him everything she had, and he was about to find someone new to receive what was left. The struggles behind the smile. In the fall of 1982, Dan Broderick hired a new legal assistant named Linda Kokena. She was 21 years old, a former Delta Airlines flight attendant who had been fired for what the airline politely called conduct unbecoming an employee. She had no paralegal training and could not even type. But she was young, blonde, and beautiful, and Dan paid her well to sit at the desk right outside his door. Betty was 35 years old at the time. She had given Dan 4 children, 15 years of her life, and every ounce of belief she had ever owned. Now she could feel something shifting inside her own house. There were the late nights at the office, the expensive new clothes in his closet, and the strange way her husband talked about Linda when he thought she was not listening. By October of 1983, Betty was certain about the affair. So on the 22nd of November that year, on Dan's 39th birthday, she did something that I personally find almost cinematic in its boldness. She drove down to his law office with champagne and flowers to surprise him. She walked inside only to find the office completely empty, because both Dan and Linda were already gone together. Betty drove home in silence. She walked straight into Dan's closet. She gathered up every single one of his expensive tailor-made suits and shirts. She dragged them out into the backyard. She doused them in gasoline, and then she lit a match. Years later, she would joke that his tailor loved her, because Dan had to order an entirely new wardrobe the very next day. But the fire did not burn out the affair. It only confirmed it. In February of 1985, Dan finally moved out of the family home. By September that year, he had filed for divorce. Betty was now 37 years old, with 4 young children and no income of her own, watching her husband openly court a woman who could have been her daughter. Her anger took on shapes that grew stranger by the month. She smashed a Boston cream pie all over Dan's bedroom. She drove her car onto his property again and again. She began doing something none of the children would ever forget, dropping them off one by one at Dan's doorstep and driving away, hoping he would finally see that he needed her. He did not see it. He only saw a woman coming apart, and he reached for the one weapon he had spent his whole career sharpening, the law itself. Here is where the story takes a turn that most people have never heard before. The pearls she gave away. A San Diego real estate broker named Kimberly Dotseth spent 3 years writing letters back and forth with Betty in prison. What Dotseth discovered, looking at 20 years of public property records, was that Betty Broderick was not destroyed by an affair. She was destroyed by paperwork. In February of 1986, Dan wanted to sell the family home at 5555 Coral Reef Avenue in La Jolla. Betty refused to sign the papers twice, so Dan walked into a San Diego courtroom and asked a judge to give him the authority to sign on her behalf. The judge said yes. The house sold for $325,000. Betty received her share of the net proceeds, but the home itself, the place where she had raised her babies, was simply gone. Years later, that same house sold for over $1.5 million. That was the moment something inside Betty snapped in a way that nothing else could put back together. She got into her car, drove straight to Dan's new house, and rammed it through his front door. There was a butcher knife under her seat. The court sent her to the county mental health hospital for 3 days of observation. The financial pressure only grew worse from there. Dan was bringing home roughly $1 million a year at his peak. The court ordered him to pay Betty $9,000 a month in support, which the judge later raised to $12,500, and eventually all the way up to $16,100. On paper, Betty looked like a rich divorcee. In her own daily math, she had only about $2,000 discretionary dollars left over after her mortgage and her taxes. And then there were the punishments. Every time Betty violated one of Dan's restraining orders, even with a phone call, he would deduct $100, $250, $500, even $1,000 from her next support check. A judge eventually ruled those deductions improper. But by then, the damage to her sense of safety was permanent. A magazine investigation later revealed that 6 days before Dan left Betty, he wired $175,000 to his brother in Colorado. None of it appeared in his financial disclosures to the divorce court. Betty had given him her youth, her education, her body, her name. And now he was hiding their money too. The tragic morning. On the 22nd of April, 1989, Dan Broderick married Linda Colcana in the yard of their home in the Marston Hills neighborhood of San Diego. Linda asked Dan to wear a bulletproof vest under his tuxedo. He refused, but he did hire undercover security to watch the gates. That is the kind of fear they were already living with by then. Just 1 month earlier, in March of 1989, Betty had walked into a local shop and purchased a revolver. She would later tell investigators that she bought it during a very dark period in her life. Whether that was true or not, she now had a loaded weapon in her possession, and months of intense anger building inside her. In the final week of October, Betty took a vacation to Acapulco, Mexico, with her new boyfriend, Bradley Wright. She came home tanned and very quiet. On the morning of Sunday, the 5th of November, 1989, just 2 days before her 42nd birthday, she got out of bed at her La Jolla home, took the key that her daughter Kim had given her, and drove to 1041 Cypress Avenue in Marston Hills. It was around 5:30 in the morning, and the house was completely silent. Betty walked upstairs to the master bedroom, where her ex-husband and his new wife were asleep. She raised the revolver and fired several shots. Linda suffered fatal injuries and died at the scene, while Dan was seriously wounded in the attack. The remaining bullets struck nearby objects in the room. Dan was still alive. He reached toward the phone on his side of the bed. Betty walked over and ripped the cord straight out of the wall. According to what Betty later told the Los Angeles Times, Dan looked at her and said, Okay, you got me." Then he went quiet for good. Betty walked out of the house, drove away, and called her daughter Lee. Witnesses later said she told Lee 3 short words: "The bitch is dead." Her boyfriend, Bradley Wright, was eventually the one who broke a glass door at the Cypress Avenue house, found the bodies, and dialed 911 in a voice that was barely human. Later that afternoon, Betty walked into the San Diego Police Department with an attorney and surrendered. The first trial began in the fall of 1990. Life behind bars. Betty's defense attorney, Jack Early, argued that years of psychological and financial abuse had pushed her far beyond her breaking point. The jury could not reach a verdict. 2 jurors held out, saying the killings looked more like manslaughter than murder. The foreman of that hung jury said something afterwards that still echoes today. He looked at the cameras and asked the question on every viewer's mind: what took her so long? The prosecution refused to accept the deadlock. A second trial began in the fall of 1991. On the 10th of December that year, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder, plus the illegal use of a firearm. On the 7th of February, 1992, the judge sentenced Betty to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life, plus 2 more years for the gun. The math came out to 32 years to life, behind bars. Betty entered the California prison system at 44 years old. She came up for parole for the first time in 2010. A board commissioner named Robert Doyle looked across the room at her and told her plainly that her heart was still bitter, that she had shown no real progress, and that she was still stuck in the same mode as 2 decades earlier. She tried again in 2011 and was denied. She tried one final time in 2017 and was denied yet again. Her 4 children were split right down the middle on what should happen to her. Lee and Rhett supported her release. Kim and Daniel IV opposed it. Rhett, who was only 10 years old on the morning of the murders, once told Oprah Winfrey that his mother was actually a really nice lady. Kim, the eldest, said visiting her mother in prison was the worst heartache she could imagine outside of losing her dad. And now, on the morning of the 8th of May, 2026, all 4 of them stood in that hospital room together. They watched their mother finally let go. The same hands that once burned a closet full of suits. The same hands that once fired a revolver in a quiet bedroom. The same hands that wrote thousands of pages of prison letters finally went still. Betty Broderick was finally free, just not in the way she had ever wanted to be. So tell us honestly, down in the comments, do you think Betty Broderick was a monster, a broken woman, or somehow both at the same time? We read every single comment, so drop your real thoughts down there right now.